Hi there, everyone. This is Hayden B. Siegel. I'm coming back at you with another video. This time, I decided to do just generally a overview of what cantillation is and I guess, the history up to a certain point of Jewish musical notation. Uh, yeah, so we're going to go ahead and do this because I've actually got a couple people that are watching these. They watched the first one at least, and they were really excited about it. I had a very great conversation this last week at Synagogue, as well as with one of my old rabbis from out in Texas. He called me up after I sent him the video, so that was really nice. Big heartfelt thanks goes out to Cantor Shoshana Abrams for setting me on this path, as well as Rabbi Andrew Bloom for assisting in that, as well as Rabbi Paris, who's no longer with us, unfortunately. Anyway, this video is going to be based on an article that I wrote a while back for the Orthodox Union. I don't know if they actually ever published it or anything, but I did put a lot of research into it with the hope of, putting out more resources for Jewish musicology that focused really on our music history. As if you'd seen the last video, that was like one of the things that ended up resulting in me not feeling comfortable in a publicly funded college here in the U.S. was that it was really our music form as Jews is drilled out of our society musically, right? So it's not something that you really get to learn about unless you go to some place like Yeshiva University or if you are in Israel, right? Highlight there, actually, I may end up getting the sheet music for the Solomon Sulzer music theory analysis from Yeshiva University here in New York. We were talking about that, so I don't know. We'll see. It'll be a lot cheaper than having to have Israel ship them over here. But anyway, so just to highlight, I guess, who I am again, I am a musician, composer, active participant in the Jewish community. I go to Shabbat quite regularly. And actually, this prior Shabbat, I did get to talk to our cantor, and as well as a musician from Israel. And the musician from Israel, from Natalia, look, I'm going to do Solomon Rossi. I promise. If you're watching this, I'll do that. But I was speaking to the cantor, and he mentioned Yosele Rosenblatt, and then I started researching it. And I knew the name a little bit, but I started researching who Yosele or Joseph Rosenblatt was, and I was like, no, the next video is definitely going to be on that, and then I'll get to Sullivan Rossi at some point. I really want to do Greco Maybear, and I really would love to do a theoretical analysis on the prophet. But that will come up in a couple weeks from now, I guess. I think I'll try to stick to some sort of 2 week schedule here, publishing a video every 2 weeks in this vein. I don't know how committed I will be to that, but I will do my best if people continue to find this interesting, right? Uh, anyway, let's go ahead and move into what this subject is, and it's really just an overview of cantillation, right? This is not a video on like how to actually cant or how to actually sing the Psalms or anything like that. There's tons of videos on YouTube specifically for that. And there's tons of papers on that. Or you could just go to Hebrew school, as I did, to learn a little bit about that. So what I'm trying to do is to bring forward our music history. So I've seen all over YouTube and the internet, for that matter, tons of resources on Jewish history that focuses on the people in the diaspora, what our history is archaeologically through the Spanish Inquisition to the Haskalah or the Enlightenment, so both good and bad, right? Destruction of the temple, but then also the return from the Babylonian exile. You can find that anywhere. And then there's also a bunch of history videos that focus on rabbis or other predominantly non-musical Jewish figureheads within Jewish society. However, I found it very difficult to find videos that actually looked into music and the history of our music as an art form. This I'm gonna try and get this in an hour. I'd be surprised if the video runs shorter than that, because this is a very dense topic. We're packing a lot of history. I'm sure I'm gonna miss stuff. I'm sure I may make some mistakes here and there. I know I watched the last video and there were a couple mistakes I made in there that I already called out. If in the future I revisit topics, then I'll be sure to correct those then, but feel free to leave comments in any of these videos if you notice anything. I am not an all-encompassing source of information or knowledge. I am just a human being and have mistakes as well as anybody else, and I'm always willing to learn something that I don't know. So anyway, let's dive down into it. Music is at the heart of Judaism. It is the heart of the Jewish art form. It is so encompassing within Judaism that you find references to music both within the Torah, within the Talmud, orally passed between us. It's always been something that's present within our culture. If you go to a synagogue these days, you will more often than not hear people singing and generally enjoying themselves. Even outside of synagogue, if they're having a celebration, you sing the Hava Nagila or something like that, to celebrate, and have a good time. It is our fundamental art form. Unlike other cultures, except maybe like Islam, which came later than Judaism, generally images of like mankind has been forbidden within Judaism. That's not like a hard and fast rule. It is something that gets has been, I guess, relaxed more or less over time, especially in our modern day. But there are examples of pictorial art, we'll say, being forbidden. Specifically, Shemot or Exodus 23-4 says you shall make no graven image, and that policy was passed down after the Torah to the Israelites into the diaspora, and we can see it really taking an impact historically on the Jewish people. Specifically, I know there was a video I watched a couple years ago when they found the Haggadah. It was the Griffin Haggadah. So if you've ever seen it, if you haven't, just Google it. But basically, there are images in this Haggadah, but they're all griffins instead of actual people, because you should not make an image of a person or an idol, right? So we see this countlessly throughout, I guess we'll say like late Jewish history. It's kind of hard to define a time because we're talking about medieval age. I would say is like later Jewish history because it is like later in our history, right? But and it is my belief that this prohibition, more or less, that again was pretty much relaxed over time because we do have contemporary sources of Jewish painters that paint portraits and stuff. That expressionism and other forms of abstract art that abstract away from the pictorial form really find their roots within the Jewish community and find a lot of I guess a lot of forward progress or movement during the Haskalah or the Enlightenment, right? That's essentially towards the later end of the Haskalah is when the abstract art form really started to be a thing, and so that's just a personal belief as somebody that actually, I really love art myself. I go to the museums all the time, so that's just something that I've kind of mulled around in my head. If you disagree, that's fine. Go ahead and just leave a comment. I'll probably respond to it, and we can have a little sidebar there. Whatever, it's cool. I like to be approachable if possible. But due to that, what I would say our art form really is again music, because that was one thing that didn't violate that prohibition. We could always sing, even if you were an Israelite and you're crossing the desert. Maybe you didn't have an instrument with you, but you could sing in chorus with the other Israelites as you're walking through this blazing hot desert. The Negev, if you've ever been there, is no joke, especially if you're there like around this time. If you're there around Elul, which is the month we're in, or like around Rosh Hashanah, it's brutal, man. Israel is definitely the Middle East as much as the rest of the Middle East, right? Um, so anyway, following the destruction of the second temple, there is a huge blow to the spirit of the Jewish people. So much so that we even have a holiday to this day where we still mourn it, known as Tish B'Av, right? But following it specifically, the mourning was so significant for the Jewish people that we actually internally decided to prohibit music, right? For a period of time. Now, this did ultimately get relaxed. We see that by about 5200, or that's the late 1400s by the Christian calendar, that music's starting to become fully a part of service again. But up until that time, there's some questions on if it should even be. If you watch the last video, with Solomon Suisar and bringing in the church organ, there's always been some sort of relaxedness as we progress. If you're into it, I guess there is this notion that the Israelites in the desert, and I agree with this, obviously, were the closest to God. They were the most enlightened people, and ever since then, we've kind of stepped back and delineate or gone a little bit away from that. As you can tell, I've shaved. I had a haircut today because it was brutally hot, right? And so typically before Rosh Hashanah, so that way I can atone for it on Yom Kippur, I do my annual shave, and that way I don't chew on my beard when I'm eating food. If you have a very long beard, if you're that type of Jewish person, and you know how to keep the mustache from being something that you eat, then leave a comment below, because I hate shaving. I actually went to the barber to do this. So again, generally the Jewish people should always seek to hold dear the commandments of the Torah. Now, I'm not like a rabbi, so I'm not going to preach to you on what you should or shouldn't do, but it is at least my belief that there's a line, and along that line you can be above the line, which is super righteous, or you can be below the line. But what we're being asked to do is toe the line, to at least keep the line, keep the relationship. Don't break from it completely, but you also don't have to be like, we're humans. Nobody's perfect. Even Moshe, even King David, they all messed up essentially and had their mistakes. We're human beings. It's understandable. That's why in Judaism there's supposed to be a lot of empathy as well. But again, you got to toe the line. There are certain things that have been cited as apostasy throughout history, into today and such. So anyway, during that time following the second temple being destroyed by the Romans, synagogues are now the thing. Instead of a temple, we have synagogues, and in those synagogues, generally music is prohibited due to this time of severe mourning. Slowly again, those barriers broke down, and we see the first serious codification of, I guess, modern cantillation, we'll call it, and I'll touch on that a little bit later, around 4710, which is 950 by the Christian calendar. And when I say Christian calendar, I mean like after the alleged existence of their Messiah. So after about 4710 or 950 onward, we start to see a greater influence of revival or resurrection of our music. If you want to, you can consider this period of time, these somewhere around like 800 and some odd years, as Shiva, right? If you're Jewish and somebody passes away, then you sit Shiva. You cover the portraits in their house of that person, so you can move on from that, and find peace, and out of respect as well. And this is the same thing. Instead of having generally more music in synagogues, we sat Shiva, and we didn't really do that so much. I'm not going to say at all because there are cases where it was discussed and so on and so forth. But at this period of time, especially, there would be no musical instrumentation whatsoever. And it would not be until a good deal later that there would be any musical equipment or instrumentation within a synagogue. It would all be choir work, and even at the beginning of that, it wouldn't be where the congregation would have a choir or even the congregation would participate. They would listen to somebody recite the music to them. And in fact, on this point, Maimonides even wrote about that we should still be sitting Shiva and still not have music during his time. That's the only case I could see, or that I could find, of a rabbi saying, "Wait a second, we should still be sitting Shiva," even though it's been over 1,000 years since the destruction of the temple and such. But Maimonides was very much about just reciting the words of the prayer rather than singing them necessarily, because he believed in the time of the temple that would be done. Now, I actually have a friend that plays guitar, and he feels the same way, but with the instrumentation. And we've gone back and forth a little bit because of the whole string breaking, as I brought up in the last video. And my point was, like, I play a bass, I've got bigger strings, those things hardly ever break. Plus, they had instrumentation in the temple, yada, yada, yada. It's really great discussion I've had with him. And we've gone back and forth. He's changed my mind on some stuff. I hope I've changed his mind on some stuff too. He's a great resource, good friend. Met him when I first moved out here to New York, actually, through a really weird coincidence. But I'll put that in a comment because it's a great story, but it doesn't really pertain here. So anyway, despite this prohibition, again, music is very important to the Jewish people. In the Talmud, Rabbi Zira expounds on our endearment towards music by explaining that blessings must be sung, that they cannot simply be recited. This is like the counterpoint to Maimonides, as I said earlier, where he believed that we're still in a period of mourning, so we shouldn't sing the prayers, we should recite them. But Rabbi Zira was very adamant that we should sing them, because to merely read the blessing has no personal connection to the blessing. You can just read a book and just read the lines or the words on the page, as I am. I've got a script up here behind me that I'm kind of reading from. So you can do that and you get sort of a loose idea, but when you sing the words, you have to internalize them, so that way you can express them through creativity, right? You have to actually at least more so know what the words of the prayer are. Or even for those people, and this is also a sidebar on that, I guess, is for me, when I was growing up in Los Angeles as a kid, I think it was Beth Israel. We had a rabbi. I went to 2 synagogues out there, but I think it was at Beth Israel. I was a very young kid, like maybe 4 or 3. I used to have to go with my brother when he was in Hebrew school because we didn't have like a babysitter or anything. And I remember the rabbi giving a talk about, there was this story about a young kid that didn't know any of the words of the prayers yet. And probably talking about me because I didn't know any of the words of the prayers yet. I was like 3. So he felt a little bit ashamed. And so what he did was he got a comb and some wax paper, right? And I don't know if people still do that these days, but that's how you can do a little kazoo. You get a comb and you cover it in wax paper and then you blow on it, right? And so this kid brought this comb in, covered in wax paper, and as the people of the synagogue were chanting the prayers, the kid blew on the comb and harmonized with the congregation. Of course, when this happened, everybody in the congregation looked back at the kid and were like, but the rabbi comes forward, brings the kid up front, and doesn't admonish him. He says, I like what you're doing. You want to connect with this, even though you just learned how to speak at 3, or however old kids learn how to speak. Obviously, I don't have children of my own, or else I'd know that probably. But I know they learn how to speak at a young age, and by 3, generally people know how to speak words and all that. But to sing prayers that would only be slightly familiar with because you're still a very young child is difficult. So the rabbi was impressed that he wanted to join in the prayer with the congregation, and so the only way he could do that at 3 was to basically bring a kazoo. Um, and so again, with Judaism, you have maybe your prohibitions, but you also have to have empathy because we're all human beings, right? So for that child, although he should have been singing, he wanted to connect, and so he played a kazoo, a comb kazoo, right? And so that's the same thing here. What Rabbi Zera was essentially saying is that we should, whenever we do our blessings or psalms, whenever we're reading from the Torah, we should personally connect with it. It shouldn't be something that just gets done quickly. Like actually, Rabbi Gideon from Eretz El here in New York, where I go, who's staying with us through the high holidays before he makes Aliyah to Israel. Mazel tov to him and his family. He made a point, I think it was not this Shabbat, but last Shabbat, that I really liked. He said, when you're saying the Shema, or any prayer really, you need to slow down. Don't just say it quickly. Shema Yisrael. No. Shema Yisrael Adonai Adonai Echad. And even when you whisper it, the second line, you whisper it slowly so people can understand it, so God can understand it. You need to take the time to actually show respect to what that prayer is, to our God, to Adonai, and internalize it. Know what that means. In fact, when I had Passover this last year, on the same point, the gentleman who I had the debate with about, or not debate, but discussion about music and such, I was reading the Haggadah that I have. It's a Maxwell House Haggadah that my grandparents got from Maxwell Coffee House. And I was struggling with a little bit of the Hebrew. My Hebrew is not the greatest. This is one of the reasons why I would like to move to Israel, make Aliyah, is because when I'm surrounded by it again, I know I'll pick it back up fully. When I was a kid, I spoke decent enough Hebrew. My brother was really the better one with the language. And to this day, I can still read it, and I still can do the prayers and stuff, but I'm slow, okay? That's all I'm saying. I'm a little bit slow sometimes. And he was like, just read in English, because then you'll know what it means too. And so we did parts of it in English and then parts of it in Hebrew. This may have also been because we were 4 glasses of wine into the Haggadah at this point too. And so it was a long Seder. And actually, he showed up late, so I was 6 glasses of wine into it because I had already finished my first 2 glasses doing the entire Haggadah in Hebrew, and we get all the way to the end after the 4th glass, and I'm like, I'm really struggling here, man. So it's always important to, according to Rabbi Zera and several rabbis, generally you should have a connection to what these things mean, and so instead of just reciting the prayer and being robotic and just reading it from a page, adopt it, take it into you, and then create it, express it. And I'm going to touch back on this point at the very end of this video, actually. So Rabbi Zera wasn't the only person to really connect this idea of music within the Talmud. It is very thoroughly digested within the Talmud. In fact, both Rabbi Shefta and Rabbi Yohan, Sheftaya and Rabbi Yohan, go on to explain in Megillah 32a that cantillation of the Torah should be sung instead of recited, but it also needs to be sung in a pleasant manner in order to satisfy the requirement of presenting a good statute for the people of Israel. What they meant by this is you shouldn't have somebody that's just a really bad singer being your chazan or cantor, right? You should have somebody that actually can do this, so people want to listen to these prayers, instead of, if you just speak it, it gets monotone, it's droll, It's not something that would readily capture the attention, and you still want that. Of course, the subject matter should be something that captures people's attention, but unfortunately, we're human, and if you've ever watched C-SPAN or any government broadcasting wherever you're at, except maybe Israel because the Beit Knesset is intense, uh, then you know that those topics can be very dry. Even if it's something that's very exciting, they could be discussing, like a war or something, or like here in the U.S. Recently with evacuating people and such. Uh, that's very exciting news. Not the best news, but it's very exciting. However, when it's just a bunch of politicians in a room talking about it, it gets really boring. Same thing with history professors, I think. At least I feel like. I love history. My family loves history. My father, my grandfather. But not everybody does. It's usually a topic that people fall asleep during for whatever reason. Maybe if we sung history lessons, people would listen, especially if the history teacher was a good singer. So, again, that's in Megillah 32a. They discuss that it needs to be a good statute, and not only just for the people of Israel, but so that when God is listening to the service to him, that it would be pleased, So, very much so, not only should we have a connection with music, but we should have somebody that knows how to sing it. Of course, everyone in the congregation, I believe at least, should be active participants in these psalms and prayers, but you should at least have a good melody. You should have somebody that knows how to sing it, how to present the music. You should have a musician, essentially. Give us musicians a job at the temple or at your synagogue, right? Now, the Torah, or the system for singing the Torah and the Psalms, was passed down like most Aboriginal forms of music, and it is an Aboriginal form of music. That means original culture's form of music. It was passed down orally, but there were always loose, I guess, cheat sheets, you could say, of how things would be sung with colloquial methods. This is before any real codification was done. This was there to present from the time of the Talmud on backwards, to really train people on how to do this. This first system, again, was very colloquial. It wasn't very well codified, we'll say, and generally it's known as the Kerabot system, which is still employed in very specific tunes unto this day. We still find this system of notating and actually accentuating the vowels and so on and so forth, and how to sing these tunes. For one example, we have the Amidot. It's an ancient piece of music because it uses the Kerabot system. This system was developed sometime prior to 3690, which would be 70 before the Common Era by the Christian calendar. No real dating system on that. It is an ancient form. I know there was at some point, because it is referenced by other Jewish music historians, manuscripts will say that existed at least around the first codification, I'll call it, that occurred in Tiberius later, of these forms of music, right? So we know that there was an existence, at least cheat sheets, maybe not a full method of notating music, that did exist in antiquity and were passed down. Now, despite the antiquity of this system, it was still continually improved, even past the first codification of the newer system, which I'll get into that here in a minute, all the way up until about 5100, or that would be like the early 1400s by the Christian calendar, right? 5100 obviously being the Hebrew calendar. This system of the Kerabot style received its final redaction from Rabbi Jacob ben Moshe Molin Halevi of Menis. And this happened during the second codification. The second codification is something that I need to honestly dive a little bit more in. I'll touch on it lightly here, but I didn't know there was a second codification until I talked to the cantor, and he wasn't aware of the first codification, but he did know that there was a second codification around the 5100 mark, or 1400 by the Christian calendar. So it was a really great discussion because we kind of compared notes there for a minute. Um, so these cheat sheets were eventually loosely codified and included not just like how to actually sing the Torah, which was mostly passed down orally, but also for psalms as well as folk psalms outside of religious worship. And those again survived and allowed us to generally like resurrect our musical traditions from uh, after, we'll say, the main time of mourning, the main Shiva passed. However, it does need to be noted again that despite the reintroduction of music into synagogues, into worship, we are still mourning the Second Temple, and there's a holiday. I don't know if holiday is really the best word for it, but there's a holiday for that. It's known as Tish B'Av. And generally there's no merrymaking, no noise, like merry noise making or singing done during Tish B'Av because you're mourning the Second Temple, right? Um, so again, although the mourning period had sort of, I'll say, passed, there were, standouts, of course, throughout history, even until today, where people would possibly say, you shouldn't be doing any music, it needs to just be recited due to the destruction. But we still have clues from before the like even directly following the destruction of the Second Temple. We have clues that the art form was kept alive, at least on paper. If it wasn't being sung, then somebody was at least, keeping up with the notation style, keeping up with the oral tradition, and passing down those melodies so students would still learn. Uh, this comes out in the Talmud a couple times. We have Berchot 62, in which Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak describes the method in which a choir or congregation should be conducted, as well as the modern hand movements that you do while you're reading the Torah. If you've ever been up there to make the Aliyah where you read from the Torah, if you watch your rabbi very closely, you'll see them do this, and that's them doing the hand movements for how this should be sung. And generally there's a rabbi, and it'll either be the chazan or the assistant rabbi that will actually use the yad and point to the Torah, and they'll read it, and as they're reading it, there'll be somebody over there doing the hand movements to help guide them along, because within the Torah, you don't have any of these musical notations specifically. There are notations that tell you when to pause, Pusak and such, but the system of notation that I'm talking about here was something that was generally, it's not written in the Torah, it'd be used in your Siddur or your Psalm book. It would be used whenever you're learning your how to sing the Torah. Generally, though, these hand movements were how we passed those down orally. And it was the same thing in Gregorian chant. When Gregorian chant first started, there was no musical notation. And Gregorian chant started, really it was about 40-60 by the Hebrew calendar, or 300 by the Christian calendar. Gregory went around with his fingers and would point to the spaces or line, and that would indicate you sing higher, you sing lower, right? And there wasn't, similar to within Cantillation, key signatures. Each person decided where their C would be, so there was like a floating C, or essentially how low or high you would start singing at. Very similar, right? So these methods of music back then, for the most part, were conducted by hand or passed down by hand. But within the Kerbot system, you would have like a loose notation that would be used primarily outside of synagogue for teaching how to sing this. Um, on that same note, oh, I'm sorry, I should mention here those hand movements for how it should be read, found within Barchot 62, were developed or were written down, I should say. They were developed long prior, but we know they existed definitively and had a codified style for what those hand movements should be around 40, 60, or 300 sorry, 300 by the Christian calendar. Whereas within Gregorian chant, that was very fledgling for them, and they went through several different hand movements between like 40, 60, all the way up until when was it? I think it was 4785, so that'd be like 1025 of the Christian calendar. That's generally when those hand movements solidified, and then there was actually a notation for Gregorian chant around that time, which we'll put a pin in that. I'll get back to that here in a minute. But at least for Torah cantillation, at the time of writing Barchot 62, those hand movements were set in stone. Everybody knew them, which is why it was included in the Talmud. Alternatively, Rabbi Yohan deliberated on the matter of whether a fee should be charged for teaching how to cant in Nedarim 32a. And this is only a couple decades, short decades, a little bit more than a couple, but a few short decades following the destruction of the Second Temple. And his question was, well, now the temple's gone, so do we still have to pay for these musicians, for this cantor? Should we still pay to teach our fundamental art form, like the one thing that we as Jews have? Or is it just up in the air? What should we do, right? So we know at least through the Talmud, which is, although it's a religious document, it is found archaeologically at certain time periods that it was written. So we know that these passages were written at this time, or published at this time, I should say. Whether or not you agree with the religious content is a totally different question. But just speaking from a historical perspective, we know that this was being discussed around those times, very short period of time after the destruction of the Second Temple. So we kept, even though we were in this very prohibited time, we kept our music alive, specifically discussing how to teach it, how do we pass it down, now that there's no temple. And even, I should also mention, even after we lifted, I guess, our self-imposed Shiva or mourning on music, there were external influences still prohibiting the proliferation of any music or any art form from the Jewish people, specifically following the Second Temple, the Romans that captured and enslaved us and occupied the land of Israel. They wouldn't allow it, and then later on, the church obviously wouldn't allow it either. Hence why Gregorian chant gets mostly taught over, unless you're in a Hebrew school of some sort, why Gregorian chant takes the stage when it comes to towards teaching the history of music, even though this earlier system does definitely exist. Now, the first major codification of, I will say, the modern system of musical notation, outside the hand movements, outside the Kerbot system, is the Ta'amin system. And this was conducted primarily by the Ben Asher family around 4710, or that'd be 950 by the Christian calendar, in Tiberias. Later, that system that they produced would be largely published in Sfat and distributed throughout the diaspora, where it proliferated within Jewish communities until it was recolloquialized, hence why there needed to be a second codification, because we now had the musical system, or the musical notation system, and that went everywhere in the diaspora. But what those musical notes specifically related to that became very locally judged, right? So it'd be like maybe if you were in Poland, or I guess back then maybe like Prussia rather, versus the Iberian Peninsula or Spain, you might have the same musical notes on the page, but you would sing it differently, right? And so that's generally where the second codification comes in, much later around the 5100 mark, or the 1400s by the Christian calendar, wherein they took that musical notation system and they actually took prayers from the psalm melodies from over here and over here and over here, and they just combined them and figured out what would be the standard of the day, um, for how these psalms would be canted, how things would be sung. The Torah is aside from this, that one's set in stone from antiquity. There may be, I guess, slight ornamental changes, we'll say, to that, but how it was sung is how it was sung back then. And by ornamental, I mean a musical ornament. So a musical ornament is a temporary deviation from the melody to accentuate it, right? It's not meant to alter the melody. It's just like if you add a trill, we'll say, on a violin in a a concerto or something like that. That's up to the musician. That's just they're having fun with the presented musical notation. It would be the same thing here. And this goes back to what Rabbi Zera was saying, was that we need to internalize this music so that way we can express it, creatively, so we can express ourselves in these prayers, right? So if you're internalizing it, then you're going to add ornaments. You're going to add your own flair to it, right? So that means that you're actually connecting with the music, not the musical content, but the blessings that are involved. So it's a good method of not only helping people memorize these passages and these blessings, but also it's a good method to make sure that they feel it, right? That they actually feel a connection to it. Outside of the Ben Asher family, or opposed to the Ben Asher family, I should say, is the Ben Naphtali family. They're from the same period, also in Tiberias. However, they had an alternate notation system that also gets used, I should say, even until today. It's not the system that I would say that I grew up with, but it is a system that does exist. Their main difference from the Ben Asher family's notation system, and both are known as the Ta'amim, I should say, but the main difference is that the Ben Naphtali family did include vowels as well as some separate characters, a couple different characters to denote how this would be sung, right? The Ben Asher family notation system was the one that got picked up out of Sfat and disseminated into the diaspora through there, though. I think, if I am correct, the Ben Naphtali family, mainly that one stayed in the Middle East, or specifically in northern Israel. But again, their form included vowels. And traditionally, when you've got Torah passage, like if you've ever read the Torah, then there are no vowels whatsoever. And then really later on, I guess the vowels were added a lot more to help with the resurrection of modern Hebrew. In fact, I have two different Siddur. Hold on. Okay, sorry, I had to pause there for a minute. I have two different Siddur that express this point exactly. Right. The first one is the one I primarily use, I guess. This one was my father's. It was passed down to him. Comes from Tel Aviv. I use it because it's not falling apart and it looks really nice. I have my own that was given to me by my synagogue at my bar mitzvah, but it was, how many of these sidors can I carry? And it was bigger than these other two, so I decided to keep the Torah in my bag when I decided to travel the world. I was using a backpack, and Torah was pretty heavy. But if you look, you can see it has not only the musical notations in there, but it's also got the vowels in there, right? So these little dots and lines and whatnot tell you the vowels in Hebrew, right? Whereas if I go to my grandfather's siddur, this one is really old. It needs to be rebound again. Um, but actually, if you look at the pages, you can tell the discoloration. So it was rebound sometime more recently. This siddur is, I think, from probably the 60s, maybe 50s, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so it doesn't have the date in there. But this one, I don't even know how old this is. I know it was gifted to my grandfather in the 37s, so that would have been like 5690s, 5697. But in this one, there are sections without the vowels. So, and that's the main difference. So, in some forms of, siddurim or notation systems, you will have vowels included to assist the reader. But in older siddurim, especially before or just around when Hebrew was created or resurrected, I'd say, you won't find very many vowels. Now, obviously, the siddur uses the same Hebrew that they spoke and sang and read in ancient times. The modern Hebrew of the state of Israel, that's just a language for everyday use. There was a huge debate when Israel was first founded over whether or not that's kosher, or if we should have kept Yiddish. But that's another topic entirely. When it comes to music, both systems of using the vowels and without vowels have been employed since roughly 4710, or that would be 950 by the Christian calendar. Now, alternatively, though there was the codification of Gregorian chant, it didn't really come about as a musical notation system until 4785, or that'd be 1025 by the Christian calendar, and even then it was just dots that would rise and fall on a page. None of those dots actually meant anything. The only thing that we have that we keep in modern musical notation from that system is the 5-bar staff. Everything else is, not so much used anymore. In this system, or those dots on the page is rising and falling in no specific, like, if you have the dot here, it doesn't mean it's a B, or if it's here, it would just be essentially, that you sing up here and you fall down, and it's, I guess, more of an estimate of how much you would go up and fall down, according to how far up those dots went on the page, and so on and so forth. That is known as the gamut, right? And that's what gamut, and that's what they teach in publicly funded schools, at least in the U.S. and Europe, is those dots on a page as the first form of written musical notation, and it is what formalized, I guess, for the most part, Western notation. Prior to this, at least for Gregorian chant, it copied in a lot of ways the Hebrew cantillation, the notation for showing how things should be sung were often incorporated within the lyrics, within the wording, similar to what we see in Jewish musical notation. Instead of using the 5-bar staff within Jewish musical framework, the notation's always been incorporated into the word, and that's primarily because these psalms and such are to be sung. There isn't as much instrumentation due to the destruction of the temple when all this was created. Instead, it was all choral based. So do I really need to, put things on a 5-bar staff and mark explicitly these rhythm patterns for a choir? No. If you've ever played a piece of music with a choir as an instrumentalist, I have, both liturgical music when I was playing with the symphony, as well as an opera. Choral singers have horrible rhythm, man. It's like, especially if you get a choral conductor, they're all over the place. It's blah 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 blah. You know, so that sort of style did not like really lend itself, I guess, to Hebrew cantillation, and so that's really, I guess, where the formalization of the Gregorian chant or that Western musical notation really took off, was that it was easier for an instrumentalist to read because you could mark rhythms expressly. And again, this happened not that long after the first codification of Hebrew cantillation, which was 4710 versus 4785 for the Gregorian chant, Gemut. So that's, what, 15 years, in which those systems both began to be codified into like formal music. So this period of time in human history, especially, very musical. We're trying to get a system out there so that way we can have a formal form of music, a culture of music. I would have hated to live back then, because it would have been great to, formalize some of this music and see how this was done, but obviously the standards of living, especially as a Jewish person, would have been abysmal. Now these forms of music, again, that were printed by the Ben Asher family and the Ben Naphtali, those were recolocalized outside of Tiberias pretty quickly, and very extremely, right? So if you look at the Sephardic tradition, which fundamentally the Ashkenazi tradition for these forms of music got their influence or start from, those traditions are heavily semitonal in their framework. By semitonal, what I mean by that is you have your common 12-tone scale, right? So we'll say in the key of C, in that Western semitonal, it'd be, so like C, D, E, F, G, A, B, right? That's the entire framework that you have there. Now you can have B flat, you can have, A flat or G sharp, you can have, G flat or F sharp, E flat. E's don't have a sharp, it goes straight to F, and so on and so forth. But that is the semitonal framework. However, in the Mizrahi, or particularly the Yemenite Jewish tradition, the Arabic maqam, I believe it's pronounced maqam. If you know Arabic, put it in the comments below, correct me please, but the maqam ras is employed, and what that is it's a microtonal language. So the ras would, again in the key of C, would be C, D, E flat 1/4, or E 1/4 flat, not even a full flat, not a double flat. If you know your music, there are double and single flats, but a 1/4 flat into F, G, A, B 1/4 flat, and then to C. So you have these like tones between tones. It's really fun stuff, right? And so that is primarily used within the Yemenite tradition. There are a couple other things, or in the Mizrahi and the Yemenite tradition. So like specifically with the Yemenites, not so much with the Mizrahi, but the way you do your vav is different. It's more of a wav. It's a W instead of V. So instead of vet, it'd be wet. And so if you've ever had a chance to listen to Yemenite music, it's great. I love music from Yemen, specifically because of this. It's different. It's a different tradition, even from like other Arabic forms of music, So I know from the West, at least, some great bands to look up that are outside of religious scope, I guess, would be something like the Yemenite blues. I really love Quarter to Africa. Man, that band is really good. And so if you want, I'll leave a comment. I'll list a whole bunch of groups for you below. But actually, there was this one big band, these three girls. I can't remember their name off the top of my head, but they did a song with Bulldog. But those are all, Yemenite singers, and they incorporated their traditional music into modern music. And it's different from even if you listen to music from Iraq versus music from Syria. They have a very distinct culture. In fact, the deli up the street, he's from Yemen, and we were talking about this morning because his father knows Hebrew. Although they're not Jewish, his father knows Hebrew because they lived next to Jewish people when they were still in Yemen. Of course, they left Yemen because it was a bad situation, as well as those Jewish neighbors, and moved to the U.S., whereas those Jewish neighbors were airlifted to Israel. But so we see this little bit of colloquialization happen following the notation, the first codification. That colloquialization more or less gets a bit smoothed out, but even after the second codification um, in 5100 or 1400 by the Christian calendar, wherein the melodies are more so codified, not the notation, but how we should actually sing those, that divergence there still exists. So if you go to a Yemenite synagogue to this day, you're going to hear the Arabic maqam, that rast, instead of the more familiar Western semitonal music. And even though, I should express this here too, even though the Sephardic and Ashkenazi tradition are more so on that semitonal scale, there are still, if you go listen to the music, on occasion, you will still have, a microtonal note thrown in here or there, usually for ornamental purposes. I know the cantor, not Shoshana Abrams, but the Chazan that they used at Ahava Shalom in Fort Worth, Texas. Very great singer. I mean, amazing. Whenever we did Yom Kippur services, he would every now and then have more of an Arabic flair, I guess, or more Middle Eastern, I should say, flair to the music than if I was elsewhere. So it's really, again, it's up to the Chazan or the cantor to make those ornamental changes. So again, you can have you have your main melody, but you get to, as somebody that's a musician, as somebody that's working with this music, do a little bit of your own thing, put your own little twist on it. And that's very important because it inspired the Jewish community to really compose and work on these melodies. So since, like, after all that, since a lot of this music and a lot of these psalms didn't even have music to begin with, we see unto this day Jewish musicians that compose and recompose the music. Josh Erich is a friend of mine, lives on the west side. He rewrote the Torah, the first 5 books, and gave it more of like a show tunesy kind of feel. Broke from the tradition, I guess, a little bit there, but he also did some of the Psalms and wrote his own stuff there. I have some of my own arrangements that I did when I was working at a Hava Shalom that I'll be more than happy to do theoretical analysis with you guys on. So there's a lot of creativity even to this day, even though there's a tradition and there's a method for these things outside the Torah for the most part. There's still a lot of room for creativity. Now, what does all this mean briefly for how cantillation is done? Well, cantillation in the musical notation system, as I said earlier, it's not on a five bar staff, right? Instead, there are these things called tropes, which are usually in 4 characters that, when arranged in different patterns, will tell the reader to sing a different pattern of music. And there's some give and take here. So, like, the person that I learned from had some various, a bit of different pitches. And that's also the same, that's also something that I saw when I was more recently looking up Cantillation online to make sure that I could get this video correct. But there are a little bit of variations between what I guess the spacing between notes would be. And if you are more interested in that, Steve Reich, very great musician, very great composer. Man, his album Counterpoint is amazing. He in the 5740s, actually it was the 5730s, so the 1970s, went to Israel to reconnect with his Jewish roots and specifically studied the cantors and cantillation very extremely, and found that, if you were from Yemen, the spacing between notes would be a little bit different than if you were from Sephardic background, and even different parts of the Sephardi. So if you were from, Morocco, the space between notes might be a little bit different from Spain. So this next little bit, take with a grain of salt, but I'll give you a couple of the notes from the trope, right? So this first one, and again, I'll probably actually take an actual video course, I think, here, because I'd like to use something other than just a notepad here. But this is an inachta. That's a bet, and that little teepee sign there is actually what the ta'amin is, the cantillation mark, right? What that tells you is that you're actually doing a perfect fourth transition over loosely 3 beats. I put all this in a 3/4 just so I could show the accentuation, but again, choral singers not the best with rhythm, so you might get somebody that does it in a 4/4 and they do the 1 beat and then hold this for 3. But a perfect fourth transition means that you're going from the 1 of a chord up past the line, past the 3rd, into the 4 of the chord, right? Steve Reich put it for the Jerusalem tradition would be, instead of a perfect fourth, it would be like it would be a major 3rd up, but then a little bit sharp, right? So really it's a give or take. This is not a system with a fixed C per se, so that's also part of it. Fixed C would mean that whatever pitch you start singing in is where you take the entire piece of music, right? You're not always going to be at, middle C whenever you start singing, and so due to that, the spaces between pitches aren't perfect, they're more so generalized. There's a lot of fluidness to it, I guess. So anyway, the inachta is the first character in the trope that I'm showing you here, and there's several of these tropes. I think it's 32 in all, or there's 32 markings, but they each do 4 characters per trope. Do the math, there's a lot of different variations you can have there. So the inachta is a perfect fourth, and it's 1 beat for the 1 and 2 beats for the 2, or for the 4th. Then you have your munach, which is it's a descending 4 to the minor 3rd over 3 equal beats. So you start here and you go down to your minor 3rd, which is flat, down to your root. Just like inachta, started there on the let's see, that would be the C, right? Sorry, bass clef player, not treble clef, but that's the C, right? So you come back down to your C here for the munach, and the munach looks like this little L. Again, that's a really rough, rudimentary, big bet or vet to show the just a random Hebrew character, right? And that would be the second one in this trope, right? And the third one in this trope would be tifcha, which is like this way of a little like almost like a comma or a curved line going up. And it's a modulation. It's minor 3rd modulation. Now, modulation is when you start on your C, you modulate up to a note and come back. And this is over 3 equal spaced or equal beats provided. So you would go from C up to your E flat, back down to C. And then to finish this specific trope, you have the mercha. And the mercha is a minor 3rd transition over 3 beats, very similar to inachta, but instead of being a perfect fourth, it's a minor 3rd. So the root gets 1 beat at C here, and then E flat gets 2 beats. And again, I guess the way you would do your rhythms there is up to you. You just want to make sure that you get like the point across, I guess. So there are definite pauses in there, pusach, as it's called, um, that would tell you when to like stop singing and such. But so altogether, this trope goes inachta, munach, ticha, and mircha. And the mircha is almost like the tifka, but it's the other way. So that's just a brief overview of what the musical notation would even look like. And you would see these all over, your prayer books if you were trying to read or sing this music correctly. Now there is, just because it is the month of Elul, there is one musical instrument that, even though music was banned, I guess, or prohibited, we'll say, following the destruction of the Second Temple, there is one musical instrument that's still used to this day every year in synagogues across the world. Is the shofar. So, shofar gets blown during Rosh Hashanah and during the month of Elul. I bought this one for very cheap, actually, at the Great Bazaar in Tel Aviv. The guy practically gave it away to me because he knew I was going to Jerusalem for Rosh Hashanah, and so I was really happy. I wanted the bigger one, but that was really expensive, and this one I got for like next to nothing, and it's just a little small one. So. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoy this video. It is getting dark now, so I should probably, and this has been over an hour, so I should probably kill it here. But I hope you guys, everyone enjoyed this. Thank you for tuning in. Next video will be on Yosele Rosenblatt, and we'll just keep it going from there. If there's a cantor or a musician of Jewish heritage that you would like me to research and do one of these videos on, comment below. If you like this video, like it. If you think I'm cool, subscribe. If not, that's cool. I don't care. I just like the views, and it's something to do on Fridays. This is just enjoyable for me. And so for those of you that do enjoy, thank you very much. And enjoy the rest of your Elul. Enjoy your Rosh Hashanah and your Shabbos.